everyone, and welcome back to my YouTube channel. Today's video is going to be my November and December of 2022 wrap-up video. I know this video is coming to you late as usual. It annoys me every time I film a video or edit a video and it's really overdue. Today's like the 23rd of January, so I know it's late, but I wanted to get my best and worst books of 2022 up first, and now I'm kind of playing catch up with my wrap up videos. But I hope you don't mind too much because I've got tons and tons of horror books to talk about today. I did start filming a horror reading vlog in November, but I didn't really like it, so I never posted it. So I'm just going to talk about all those books in this video. I read a lot of short books as well because it was coming up to the end of the year and I was quite far behind on my reading challenge, which I did manage to meet in the end. I set myself a target of 70 books and I just about hit 70 books. So let's just go ahead and start talking about the first book. So the first book that I read in November was Horror Store by Grady Hendrix. I do have a copy of this book, but it is currently being circulated around work. I have previously showed it on this channel because I got it as a gift from my boyfriend and it's just the coolest book ever. It's a horror story set in a IKEA type store, so like a large furniture shop, and we're following one of the employees. I think she's called Amy, and she's asked to work in the store overnight because there's some really spooky, weird things happening in the shop overnight, and they think that somebody might be sneaking in, playing pranks on them. So they decide to get like a little team of staff to just stay in the store overnight and see what goes on. And they soon realise that it isn't just somebody playing pranks on them, it is much more serious than that. This book felt very campy, very silly, very fun, and it didn't take itself too seriously, which I really liked. The way that this book is laid out is like an IKEA catalogue. So each chapter started with like a furniture advert, and there was a map at the front, and when it was talking about graffiti in the bathroom there'd be like a picture of it, and I just really loved the process of reading this book. I mainly read this book on my night shifts at work, so it helped to make the experience feel even more scary, and I would literally jump at any noise. There were some really genuinely creepy moments, especially reading it at night in like a creepy environment, but I also liked the dark comedy in there about working in retail and about all the silly policies. I ended up giving this book 3.5 out of 5 stars overall because I really enjoyed my time reading it, but it wasn't quite as scary as I wanted it to be. But overall it was still a really good time and I definitely recommend it. The next book that I read was actually a recommendation from somebody at work. I think this book was already on my TBR, but she just read it and said it was amazing, so I read it basically straight away, and that was Sometimes I Lie by Alice Feeney. I've read a couple of Alice Feeney books before and I really love them, so I don't know why it took me so long to get to this one. In this book we're following this woman who's in a coma, but she can still hear everything that's going on around her, and she can't remember how she got into this coma in the first place, and she's trying to piece together what happened, who might have been involved. She starts thinking that her husband's a little bit suspicious, and overall I really enjoyed this book. It felt very like classic domestic thriller where you've got that character who can't remember anything and you don't know who to trust, and the big reveal is just her remembering what happened, and I really enjoyed that. I read this in 2 days, which is quite quick for me. It was very fast paced, very addictive. There were some characters in there who I genuinely hated in like a good way, like you were meant to hate them. There were some really shocking plot twists which I loved. There was a lot of like dark and disturbing things in here as well. There was one scene that I thought was a little bit unexpected, so if you don't like reading about sexual violence against women, then perhaps just be warned before you go into this one because it did kind of throw me. I thought the reveal in this book was so good because it made me really mad. I just felt so sorry for our main character and I really loved everything about this book. Overall I've given this book 4 out of 5 stars because I think I preferred His and Hers and also Rock Paper Scissors to this one just a little bit, although I still really enjoyed this one, and again would definitely recommend it if you're into domestic thrillers. I just love Alice Feeney, she's so good. I really want to read Daisy Darker, so I'm sure I will let you know how I like that soon as well. But overall I think she's such a good thriller writer and I would highly recommend picking any of her books up. The next book that I read was for part of this horror reading vlog that I started and never actually came to edit it because I didn't like where it was going. The first one that I read for this video was The Bell Chime by Mona Kabani, I think. This one really confused me because I feel like I should have liked this more than I did, and I feel like I might reread it one day. The premise of this book is that a woman finds a picture of herself on a missing persons poster, but the picture is one that she's never seen before. It's a weird creepy face that she's never seen her own face make, but it's clearly her, and this is such a scary idea just in itself. And then there's a few different parts to this book which focus on this incident and explain why she's found this poster and what has led her to this and what happens after. It felt quite weird and a bit trippy and like it didn't fully make sense until it did. But for some reason I just couldn't get into this book. It took me a really long time to get through it, even though it's quite short. I think it might have been because I was reading this before bed, like every night, and I was really tired, so I'd have to like reread bits of it again. And although I thought it was really well written and it had some good horror elements in there, I did think it got a bit like flowery and overwritten at times. But as a whole, I should have liked this book because it's told out of chronological order, which kept it really interesting. It has some like author's interjections in there, which again was another interesting element. And it also kind of reminded me of Black Mirror, which I am obsessed with. So really I should have loved this book, but I ended up giving it like a 2.5/3 star. But I do think I'm going to give this book another go someday because I'm literally convincing myself to read it again by talking about it. Like, it sounds so good. So who knows, maybe I'll read this one again one day and completely change my mind. But for now, this one is staying at a 3 star just because my reading experience was not great. And although I think I would recommend it to people, I am not going to be like gushing over it. Do you know what I mean? The next book that I read is another short horror novella. Actually, I think all of the next 3 books are short horror novellas, as well as the last one, because that was what my horror reading vlog was going to be about, and then it just failed. So the next one that I read was Crossroads by Laurel Hightower. This book was so good. When I first finished this book I gave it 4.5 out of 5, but I've since upped that to a 5-star rating, and I think I mentioned it in my best books of the year, I can't remember. So this book is about a woman who's lost her son in a car accident, and she kind of accidentally discovers that she might be able to bring him, or some form of him, back by doing certain things. I'm trying to keep it vague because it is short, so I don't want to spoil it. This is such a powerful book about grief and about how far you would go to bring somebody back that you've lost. It's really short, like I think it's 100 and odd pages, and you care so deeply for the characters in this book. The horror in it is very good, very effective. It combines both a kind of paranormal horror with real life grief, that kind of horror, and it was just really good. I cannot fault it. The reason why I gave it 4.5 when I finished it is because I wanted it to be a smidge scarier, but when I thought about it afterwards, I don't think that mattered at all. It was so powerful just how it was. I don't think I would change anything about it, and I would highly recommend this book if you like paranormal elements but also more of a psychological, emotional horror. This one will be perfect for you, and I'm so glad that I have the physical copy of this book because I wouldn't normally have bought a book this small because books are expensive even for 110 pages, but I'm so glad that I now get to keep this on my shelf. The next horror novella that I read was Comfort Me With Apples by Catherine M. Valent. This one I didn't really love. It's a very short story about this woman called Sophia who lives in this very idyllic, perfect environment, and I was very intrigued by this at the start. Like, I wanted to know what she was doing there and where this book was going to go. But I think it kind of kept everything in a little bit too long. By the time it gets to the big reveal about what's actually happening, it felt a little bit info dumpy, and the circumstances behind it felt a bit unnatural and a bit like clunky in dialogue, because it was kind of like, we need to get all this information across in such a little time. So I didn't love the structure of this book. I also didn't really like our main character. I feel like the way that she behaved at the start versus the end was very different, and there was no development as to how she got there. There was also constant references to how small she was, and although there was a sort of reason for this, which I can't remember now, it just kept banging on about how tiny and petite she was and how she couldn't fit into any of the furniture, and it just came across a bit annoying. Like, okay, we get it, she's little, she's so small and so petite. So although I really liked the idea of this story and I thought it was a clever plot, I didn't like the execution of it, so I've ended up giving it 2 out of 5 stars. I wouldn't necessarily recommend this one, but it is so short, so if you do like the idea of reading like a very mysterious character in a mysterious place, this book will literally take you like less than 2 hours. I can't really remember how long it took me. I did read it in like one sitting though, so if it sounds interesting to you, give it a go, but I'm not gonna like force you to. The next book that I read I was very scared for because it was my first extreme horror book that I've ever read, and that was Gone to See the Riverman by Christopher Triana. This is a book about a woman who's obsessed with this serial killer, and he's in prison but they send each other letters, and this serial killer basically sends our main character on this quest to go and meet the Riverman, and I think she has to give him a key. So the rest of the story follows like the backstory of our main character and also her journey with her sister to go and visit the Riverman. I really enjoyed this book actually. I thought it was going to be way more extreme horror than it was. I mean, It probably is extreme horror when you like write down what happens. There's quite a lot of disturbing stuff in here, but I thought it would be way worse, so I was actually quite proud of myself for making my way through it and coming out enjoying it. This book was actually very funny. I loved the contrast between the letters that she sent to the serial killer and the ones that she was getting back. The main character feels very like above everyone else who's obsessed with serial killers. She says that she's only speaking to him so she can get a story out of him, but then we see that she's clearly more like obsessed with him than she thinks she is, and he's just using her, but our main character is just so naive and deluded, and I just thought it was so funny. Like, I loved that little bit of humour in there. It was very atmospheric, very creepy, and there's this scene which happens in a cellar which is so gross and horrible. I read most of this book in one sitting because I was so engrossed in it. My only little letdown about this book is that the whole thing with the Riverman was a little bit of a letdown for me, but I did love the ending of this book, and other than that I had such a good time with it. Just be warned though that it is disturbing. Like, as I'm thinking about some of the things that happened in this book, it's very like psychologically disturbing. There's moments about our main character's childhood that are not okay and probably aren't fun reading for most people, but if you like kind of disturbing dark elements, then this one's really good. I ended up giving it 4.5 out of 5, and I will be purchasing this book because I really want to have a little collection of horror novellas like Crossroads that all look really tiny and just can fit nicely together, so I will definitely be buying that soon. The next book that I read was The Cabin at the End of the World by Paul Tremblay. So I was fully onto this horror train. I don't know why, but November I was just obsessed with it, and I'd already read A Head Full of Ghosts by Paul Tremblay in October. I think I gave it 3 stars, and I heard that this one was better, so I was really excited for this one. I ended up giving this one 4 out of 5 stars as well, so this sounds like a really good reading month actually. I've had quite a few like high ratings so far. So Cabin at the End of the World is about this gay couple who have an adopted child called Wen, and they're in this secluded cabin, and basically these 4 people turn up. The family have no idea who they are, but they proposition them with an idea that they've had. I don't want to say anything about it in case you don't know what the plot of this book is, because I didn't, but it puts you in a really difficult moral dilemma scenario. This book felt like such a good realistic horror in terms of what if this happened to you, what would you do? There is a film adaptation of this book coming out very soon. I think it's called Knock at the Cabin, so I will be watching that, but I'm intrigued to see how they go about portraying this as a film because it's not the most like action-packed thing I've ever read. There's a lot of dialogue, there's a lot of interesting conversation between the family and also these 4 people that have turned up. So at times it can feel a little bit long and a bit drawn out, but overall this was a really tense and stressful book. I think it's interesting because the way that it portrays the 4 people that turn up, you can either hate them or you can sympathise with them depending on like what part of the book you're at or what your own personal feelings are. And there was one thing in this book that really shocked me, and I didn't see it going that way at all, and then I loved all the conversation that came from that as well and what that meant for the family. This book is quite vague and a bit ambiguous, especially towards the end, so I don't think this book is going to be for everyone, but I quite like that, especially in a scenario like this where you're facing potentially the end of the world. It kind of reminded me of Leave the World Behind, so I really liked all the ambiguity in this book, but I know that some people aren't going to like it. So I really enjoyed this book and I'm really looking forward to the film coming out, and I'd recommend this book if you like moral dilemmas and the conversation surrounding that, and more of a quiet, vague horror that isn't like in your face action all the time, then this one will be really good for you. The next book that I have to talk about is Bunny by Mona Awad. I have already talked about this on my channel because I mentioned it in my worst/most disappointing books of the year. Spoiler alert, if you've not seen that already, then I don't like this book. I can see why people like it, and I've seen a lot of people say that this book is their favourite. For some reason it just didn't work for me. This book is about a girl called Samantha who goes to this very elite college and she's on this writing course. The only other people on this writing course are these 4 other girls who all call themselves Bunny. They're very close, they're very like touchy-feely with each other, and they give off major like cult vibes. And one day, after they've known each other for quite a long time now, they ask Samantha to come to one of their houses after school for this smut salon. And then what follows is a very bizarre and weird kind of fantastical horror story that I just didn't really understand. I feel like this book is perhaps meant to be read a little more deeply than I read it, I did try and understand where it was going, but I just found it so boring and dull. I could only read this book in like 10 to 20 pages at a time. I was constantly waiting for something else to happen to explain why it was so good, and that just never came. I thought it was very vague and it skimmed over a lot of points, but it didn't create that uneasy feeling that I really like in books like this. When you're a little bit unsure of what's going on, that can be such a good feeling, but this just didn't give me that. It left me feeling very confused, very disinterested, and I almost DNF'd this book multiple times. Even like 10 pages from the end, I thought, what is the point of finishing this book? I may as well just stop. I'm not enjoying it. And I don't know if it's just me missing something, because I know a lot of people love this book. I did read some Reddit posts that tried to explain what this book is a metaphor for, and I'm still just like not interested. And this is especially disappointing because I really hyped this book up for myself. It's a shame, but you know, we move on, it's fine. The next book that I read was another very highly anticipated book for me, and that was Confessions by Kane Minato. Apologies if I've mispronounced her name. It was actually a 5-star prediction and I gave it 4 stars, so I can't help but feel slightly disappointed in it, even though it was still a really good book. At the start of this book, we're following this teacher who's just about to resign. Her 4-year-old daughter was just found dead, and she delivers this last lecture to her students, basically revealing that she knows that her daughter's death was not an accident and that 2 of the students in her class were behind it. This book starts really action-packed and I was really hooked into this book, and then every chapter we follow from a different perspective that is related to this girl's death in some way. I really liked the writing of this book. I loved that we got to hear the story from loads of different sides, but for some reason it just didn't feel like a 5-star read, and that annoyed me. There were lots of twists and reveals in this book, but I can't help but feel like it wasn't as mind-blowing as I expected it to be. I saw a lot of reviewers say that each twist like completely blew your mind, and I just didn't get that, although they were still good. So I think this is just a case of I had way too many high expectations of this book, and although it didn't deliver on all of them, so I can't help but feel a little bit underwhelmed, but it was still a 4-star read. It was still really good and I would definitely recommend it. But yeah, I think I just thought it would be like my book of the year, so it's just kind of annoying that it wasn't. The next book that I read was another short story, and this was primarily to help me get to my Goodreads reading challenge. At this point I was a little bit panicky that I wasn't going to get there, so I was just looking at like short books on my TBR already and powering through them. So this one was The Test by Sylvain Neuvel. I'm really sorry if I've said that name wrong again, but this book is about a guy who's taking the British citizenship test, and he's such a sweet character. You instantly just love him. He's adorable. So he walks into this citizenship test and then something happens which is not expected, but this book reminded me very much of like a Black Mirror episode again. And to say this book was so short, you instantly warm to this main character and you really sympathise with him. It was a really clever setup, and I loved how we got to see from another perspective as well, which gave some insight into why what was happening. I also thought it was so interesting to put yourself in this position and imagine what you would do in this situation. I feel like it had a lot to say, and it was really scary to imagine if this situation was real. So I definitely recommend this book. I gave it 4.5 out of 5 stars because it just didn't feel quite like a 5-star. It didn't feel like a new favourite. It had the emotional impact, it had a lot of action in there, and it also had a lot to say, so it was kind of like a perfect novella, to be honest. But yeah, 4.5 out of 5 just because it's not a full new favourite. The next book that I read was another thriller, and that was Wrong Place, Wrong Time by Gillian McAllister. This is a really interesting book where we're following this woman who is looking out of the window one night and she sees her son stab another person. All of a sudden she enters into this bizarre reverse time loop where every day she wakes up and she's going like further and further back in time, and she thinks that it might be to try and stop what happened or try and understand what happened. And we're basically just following this woman as she is reliving the past, very confused and trying to discover how she can get back to her present day and how she can have stopped this situation from happening. I really liked this fantastical element in this book. It felt like a twist on a Groundhog Day scenario, and I loved how it all came together, and it talked a lot about the mother-son relationship in this book and the relationship that she has with her husband, and it just felt very like fully formed, and all the characters were very believable and likeable. Like this whole book focuses on a mother's love for her son, and I just thought it was really well done. It had some really clever twists in there that I did not see coming at all. All of the small hints came together really nicely, and it all just felt like very well written, I guess. Although I really enjoyed everything about this book, I do think that it felt a little bit too long at times, and it started repeating the same kind of sentiments over and over again, especially towards the end. and I'm not sure that I loved the last like final twist. But other than that, I really enjoyed this book. I gave it 4 out of 5 stars, and I would definitely recommend this if you like thrillers, especially if you like them where they've got that little fantasy twist in there. I thought it was really, really good. The next book is yet another horror novella, and this is Conclusive by Sarah Gran. This book is one that I mentioned in my best books of 2022 video, so you might already have seen me talk about this. But this is a book about a woman who's very ordinary, and then one day she starts thinking very weird thoughts and wanting to do very weird things that are just not like her. And she starts wondering if she's possessed, because she does this little quiz about if she could be possessed or not, and she thinks that maybe she is. I read this all in one sitting. I had the best time with it. It was very easy to read, very engrossing. I really felt for our main character, and I loved how realistic it felt. Like, it kind of felt like it could happen to anyone, and it was really scary to think about that. I don't normally love possession stories because I'm not really a fan of that kind of horror, so I was really surprised at how much I loved this book. I think because it was combined with a lot of real aspects and it felt like a real person, I think that's why I liked it more than I expected to. And I loved how this book built dread right up until the end. It just felt like it was getting worse and worse, and it felt like this character just could not get out of this situation, and I was just so hooked. I loved the ending. It was really dark, it had some really horrifying moments in there, and it was also quite sad. So I literally have no complaints about this book. I gave it 5 stars. The reason why I gave it 5 stars was because I literally could not put it down. So definitely one of my new horror novella favourites of all time. Okay, I'm going to have to get my notes for this one because there's quite a lot to talk about here. The next book that I read was a short horror story collection by Stephen King called Night Shift. So in this book there's 20 short horror stories. It took me quite a while to get through, but I've written like a tiny review about every book. I'm not going to go into all of them, I don't think, because otherwise we'll be here all day. So I gave each book a little rating, but I averaged it out to 3.475. But I'm going to round it up to give this book 4 stars overall, because there were quite a few 5-star stories in here which I really loved. So some of the ones that stood out to me were I Am the Doorway, which is a really creepy sci-fi space story. It had a really good ending and I just loved it. Another one was The Mangler, which is about a laundry machine that gets possessed by the devil, which sounds kind of ridiculous, but I didn't know I could be scared of a machine being taken over, but now I am. So that one was another 5-star one. Another one that I loved was The Bogeyman, which was about this really unlikable protagonist who went to the psychiatrist to make this confession, and it had a really good ending again, so I gave that one 4.5 stars. Another one that I loved was Grey Matter. These were all back to back, one after another, so this was like a really good part of the book, like in the middle. And this was about this guy who takes a sip out of a can of beer that tasted a bit funny, and then some awful things start happening to him. So this one was so gross. It was 10 out of 10, disgusting. Great visuals though, and yeah, another 5-star. There were 2 others that I gave 5-star, which were The Ledge, which was a guy having to walk across a ledge. Really scary, really tense, and I was definitely like in fear reading it. And then the other one that I gave 5-star was Children of the Corn, which was about this little deserted town where there's creepy kids, and it had a really dark, gross ending, so I loved that. They were all my favourites. Other ones that I really liked were Graveyard Shift, which is about a guy working for this company and there's some scurrying heard in the floor below, so they think it might be rats. I gave that 4 stars. I also liked Quitters Inc., which is about a guy who decides to stop smoking. I was a little bit disappointed in it because it was very hyped and I gave it 4 stars rather than 5 like I was expecting to. And then I also liked The Last Rung on the Ladder because it felt very like emotional human horror and it felt very different to the rest of the stories. There were a few that I didn't like at all, such as Night Surf, because I'd never read The Stand and it's set in the same universe, so I just didn't get it. I also didn't like Battleground, that one wasn't for me. I didn't like Strawberry Spring either. And then there were a few just okay ones. Like I kind of liked Trucks, it was a cool idea, but I gave it 3 stars. Same for The Man Who Loved Flowers, The Lawnmower Man, Sometimes They Come Back, and Jerusalem's Lot were kind of like okay ones. But I do think I would recommend this book as a whole, just because there were so many good stories in there. I think about half of them were like 4-star and up. I started reading this around Halloween time and then it did take me like a month to finish it, I think. But because it's short stories, it didn't feel like a long time. I really wanted to read this book because as I've read Stephen King before, I like his ideas, but I just found his writing way too dragged out. But this was a really good way to just get little snippets of a story, and I had a really good time with it overall. If you like short horror stories and you're interested in reading Stephen King, this is a really good collection. And I also think it's interesting that this came out in like the 70s, because you can't really tell that it's that old at all, but to say that this is like almost 50 years old is a bit mad. Overall, I'm going to give it a 4-star, but apparently my average rating was 3.475. But it's worth it for those stories which are like really, really good, and because they're all short, it's not a complete waste of time to get through the ones that aren't as good anyway. Okay, so we've got 2 books left. Both of these books I managed to read on the 31st of December in a mad panic because I had 2 books left to read on my Goodreads reading challenge, so I picked some very short ones to get through just so I could definitely reach that goal, which is a bit stupid, I know, but I didn't want to like downgrade the goal like a couple of days before, you know? So the first one that I read on that day was 84 Charing Cross Road by Helen Hanff, and I gave this book 5 stars. This book is basically a series of letters between the author and this bookshop, which was at 84 Charing Cross Road. The bookshop was in London and this woman lived in America, so she would write to this shop ordering books, and they end up having this really cute friendship over the years. So the correspondence between Helen and this bookshop were from 1949 to 1969, and it was just so cute. Plus, I didn't even realise that this was a true story, so that really broke my heart, because there were just some random pictures throughout this book of the guy Frank that she's writing to, and it just shook me a bit because I didn't realise this was a real person. I don't know, it just felt very wholesome, very sweet, and this book did make me a little bit teary-eyed, but I just thought it was so lovely and so endearing. It was so funny to see Helen's personality and how like sarcastic she was, and how she managed to forge this friendship over 2 different continents, and it was really quick. It only took a few hours. It was funny, it was sweet, it was sad, and I just loved it, so I gave it 5 stars. Just had to move the camera because it just cut out on me saying that I had no storage, so I've just had to delete some things. And then the last book that I read in 2022 was Animals Eat Each Other by Elle Nash. This one, I absolutely love the cover, so I kind of wish that I loved this book more than I did, because then I would have been able to buy it. But I only gave this book 3 out of 5 stars. This is about an unnamed protagonist who enters into this relationship with another established couple. So she enters as like the 3rd person of this relationship, and she's a very unlikable character. She's very selfish, self-destructive, but it wasn't in a fun, morally grey kind of way. She just felt very toxic, and although this book had good writing and it had some good like erotic scenes in there, I didn't really warm to her as a character, and I feel like it skips over quite a lot of the important parts of this relationship that I wanted a bit more of. I did finish this book wondering like what the point of it was, but I think that was the whole point. It had good writing, but sometimes it felt a bit flowery, and I do think it skimmed over or felt very surface level over some of the aspects that I would have liked it to go more into. I wish I'd liked it more, and I do like that kind of story, but yeah, this one just felt a little bit like not fully what I wanted. So that is all the books that I read in November and December. Thank you so much for watching this video. I'm hoping to be a little bit more up to date with my wrap-ups this year, so wish me luck. Hopefully my January one will be out very soon. Give this video a like if you enjoyed it, and subscribe if you want to see more, and I will hopefully see you in my next video. Bye!